What is exposure in digital photography? Ever this word came up yet? Well, let's find out what it is. In the world of digital photography, exposure refers to the amount of light that hits your camera's image sensor. In other words, the quantity of light that absorbed by the digital sensor inside your camera. This is often determined, or in other words, can be controlled by three factors: shutter speed, lens aperture, and the scene's luminance. Balancing these elements can be a dance of precision, but the reward is a beautifully exposed shot. So, exposure is essentially how bright or dark your photo turns out. Now, what does it mean to have a good exposure? It's a question that has no definitive answer. Why? Because what is considered a good exposure is subjective. It's like asking what makes a good photograph. The answer varies from person to person, depending on their intent, their vision, their story. In the world of photography, exposure refers to how much light the camera's sensor captures when taking a picture. It's a delicate balancing act between light and dark, highlights and shadows, to create an image that aligns with your creative intentions. Think about it this way. Imagine you're painting a picture. You wouldn't use just one color, right? You'd use a range of shades from light to dark to add depth and dimension. The same principle applies to photography. A good exposure doesn't just capture light, it captures the range of light, from the brightest highlights to the darkest shadows, to create a balanced, visually pleasing image. But what does this balance look like? How do you know when you've achieved it? Well, that's where the subjectivity comes in. If you're shooting a dramatic sunset, you might want to underexpose your image to emphasize the deep, rich colors of the sky. If you're shooting a bright, cheerful portrait, you might want to overexpose slightly to add a soft, dreamy quality. It's all about understanding the effect you want to create and adjusting your camera settings accordingly. You are the artist, the camera is your brush, the light is your paint. And exposure? It's how you mix those colors to create your masterpiece. But remember, it's not just about capturing the perfect exposure. It's about capturing the right exposure for your vision, your story. So how do you achieve this balance? How do you find the right exposure for your image? That's a topic for another scene. But for now, just remember this. Remember, a good exposure ultimately depends on what you, as the photographer, want to convey. And this can be achieved in two stages: on camera and later in the editing process. Ever heard of ISO being referred to as the last fortress in photography? Well, let's dive into that and explore the role of ISO in controlling exposure. You see, ISO is like your camera's sensitivity to light. In low lighting conditions, you can crank up the ISO to make your camera more sensitive, enabling it to capture more light. This is akin to turning up the volume on your stereo when the music is too soft. It amplifies the signal, in this case, the light. But why is it the last fortress, you might ask? Well, that's because ISO should be your last resort when trying to achieve a good exposure. Ideally, you'd want to first play around with your aperture and shutter speed, as these directly influence the amount of light hitting your camera's sensor. Relying too heavily on ISO can lead to noise, which manifests as grainy specks in your image. It's like when you turn up the volume too high on your stereo and start to hear static. It's not ideal, but sometimes it's a necessary trade-off when lighting conditions are far from perfect. So, how do you find a balance? It's all about knowing your camera and understanding how it behaves at different ISO levels. Practice, experiment, and learn from your mistakes. Yes, the ISO is indeed our last fortress, but use it wisely to avoid noise in your images, as it is only an amplification of the light received by the sensor, but only after it's been received, and has nothing to do with the sensor's sensitivity. This amplification can be achieved in the later stage of digital editing where the exposure can be increased. But this is not always the case. Did you know that your camera has a preconceived notion of what a good exposure is? Let's delve into that a bit. Cameras are designed with a built-in light metering system. This system gauges the brightness of the scene you're capturing and then calculates what it thinks is the ideal exposure. It's like a little mathematician in there, constantly solving equations to get the perfect balance of light and dark. Now, this system is based on the assumption that every scene should average out to a mid-tone gray, a concept known as 18% gray. It works splendidly for scenes with an even distribution of light and dark areas. However, it can be thrown off in high-contrast situations, like a bright snowy landscape or a dark shadowed room. That's where your artistic judgment comes in. The camera's metering system is a tool, not the final arbiter. You might want to override its calculations to capture the mood or details in a scene. You can manually adjust the exposure settings to darken a bright scene or lighten a dark one. So, while your camera is programmed to think a certain way about exposure, it doesn't always get it right. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Photography is a blend of science and art, and you are the artist. You can use your camera's suggestions as a starting point, but remember, while your camera tries to help, it's you who makes the final call on what constitutes a good exposure. A good rule of thumb here is what's called exposure to the right, and it practically means that you have to try to avoid the burnt areas in your photo. This cannot be possible in many cases. Most of them are when you include a light source in your frame, like the sun, a light bulb, or a fire. Is the histogram the ultimate judge of exposure? Let's find out. The histogram, that little graph you see on your camera's screen, is more than just a fancy tech feature. It's a graphical representation of the tonal values in your image, where the left side represents the shadows, the right side the highlights, and the middle, the mid-tones. Now, why is this important for exposure? Well, the histogram gives you a real-time report of the brightness levels in your shot. Are the shadows too dark, losing detail? The histogram will show a spike on the left. Are the highlights blown out, washing out the image? The histogram will have a spike on the right, so you can use this information to adjust your exposure settings. If the spike is on the left, you might want to increase your exposure, letting in more light to bring out the details in the shadows. If it's on the right, you might want to decrease your exposure, lessening the light to recover those highlights. But here's the thing. There's no perfect histogram shape. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve. A low-key image with lots of shadows will naturally have a histogram skewed to the left. A high-key image with lots of bright areas will have a histogram skewed to the right. And that's okay. What the histogram does do is it helps you avoid clipping. Clipping is when the shadows are so dark or the highlights so bright that they lose all detail, turning into pure black or pure white. And once detail is lost to clipping, it can't be recovered, not even in post-processing. So, while the histogram isn't the be-all and end-all of exposure validation, it's a very handy tool to have in your photography arsenal. It helps you measure the light in a scene and ensure that you're capturing as much detail as possible in both the shadows and the highlights. In simple, you have to see the histogram as a whatever-shaped mountain in a huge plane. When you can see the whole mountain, it has to descent to the plane on both sides. This mountain of exposure very rarely ends up to a steep cliff. When this is the case, try to have a steep cliff on the left side and the gradual end on the right. The main technical problem of capturing the right exposure with a digital sensor is the limit of its tonal range. When you observe a scene with your eyes, you can distinguish a tonal range of 21 stops. But when you are trying to capture it with your digital camera, you can only record a 13 stops tonal range. On the practical side, imagine a scene where you are at a beach bar in midsummer with your friends, and you want to have a group photo, so your friends gather around and pose for the photo. But as they stand, some of them are in the direct sun, and some of them stand in the shadow of the roof. Although the human eye can adjust to perceive to the ripples of the black clothes in the shadow, and the details of the white clothes under the sun, your camera can't. You have no problem to adjust your camera when everyone is under the sun, or even when everyone is in the shadows. But it cannot be adjusted to capture the whole range of tones. Don't be fooled by your smartphone achieving it. It relies on the advanced photo editing within the phone by software. Its dynamic range is even worse than your DSLR. It has nothing to do with you being a good photographer or not. It's your camera limitation that defines it. In this case, you have to choose what it will be captured and what will be left out. As a good rule of thumb is to try to capture as much detail as you can from the light side, exposure to the right, and forget about the dark side. There is nothing you can do about it. In any case, there are things you can do to recover some of the lost black details in post-processing. But very little when it comes to recovering from the blown-up whites, what we call the burnt areas. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.